The October wind carried a bitter metallic bite that whispered of an early winter in Gunnison County, Colorado. Claire Hartwell stood in the gravel driveway of the historic farmhouse she had spent a decade restoring her breath, forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. Across from her, Derek, her husband of 12 years, casually handed a heavy brass ring of keys to Preston Wade, a real estate lawyer whose expensive suit seemed out of place against the weathered timber and stone of the property. Claire's hands trembled inside the pockets of her worn canvas jacket, not from the cold, but from the surreal horror of watching her life dissolve in broad daylight. The farmhouse behind them stood as a testament to her labor hand-scraped floors, re-chinked log walls, a new foundation she had helped pour herself. Every corner held a memory of bleeding knuckles and aching muscles of YouTube tutorials watched at midnight and trips to salvage yards in neighboring counties. The place had been a ruin when they bought it, condemned and forgotten. She had made it beautiful again. Preston Wade offered a thin smile as he pocketed the keys. Behind him, idling in the circular drive, sat Derek's Range Rover purchased 8 months ago, though Claire had never questioned where the money came from. Through the tinted passenger window, she could make out the silhouette of Vanessa Cole, a 29-year-old architect with sharp cheekbones and an expensive haircut. The woman didn't have the decency to look away. Claire's voice came out smaller than she intended. "You can't do this." Derek didn't meet her eyes. He adjusted his watch, a new Omega she'd never seen before, and his jaw worked like he was chewing over a response he'd rehearsed. "The papers are legal, Claire. Preston verified everything. You signed the prenup." "I was 22, and I was 26. We were both young." The simplicity of his dismissal cut deeper than any shouting match could have. Claire felt her throat tighten as Preston Wade cleared his throat and gestured toward the eviction notice folded in his leather portfolio. The document gave her 48 hours to vacate the premises. 48 hours to pack up a decade of her life and disappear. Derek finally looked at her, and for a moment she searched his face for some flicker of the man she'd married. The one who used to wake her with coffee and toast, who'd promised they'd grow old here together, who'd held her hand during her father's funeral and sworn he'd never leave. But his eyes were flat, rehearsed, distant. He'd already moved on in every way that mattered. "I'll make sure your Bronco stays in your name," he said, as if that were a kindness. "And you can take your personal belongings, of course." Personal belongings. As though she hadn't stripped wallpaper and refinished banisters and rewired the entire second floor. As though her fingerprints weren't on every surface. Preston Wade shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the silence. The Range Rover's engine hummed. Vanessa checked her phone. Claire turned and walked toward the barn where her 2004 Ford Bronco sat rusted and reliable. She didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. Inside the Bronco, she sat gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. Through the windshield, she watched Derek and Preston shake hands. Watched the Range Rover pull away gravel crunching under expensive tires. Watched the farmhouse, her farmhouse, recede in the rearview mirror as she forced herself to drive. She made it 3 miles before she had to pull over. The sobs came hard and fast. Her forehead pressed against the steering wheel as the full weight of it crashed down. 12 years. 12 years of marriage, of partnership, of believing in something. Gone. When the tears finally stopped, she wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket and checked her bank account on her phone. The joint account showed a balance of $9.17. Her personal account, one she'd kept separate for emergencies, held $403. $403 to rebuild an entire life. She scrolled through her contacts, debating who to call. Her mother had passed 3 years ago, her father 5 years before that. She had friends or people she'd thought were friends, but most of them had been Derek's friends first. Couples they'd socialized with, neighbors who'd watched them renovate the farmhouse and called them inspiring. She couldn't bear the thought of their pity. The women's shelter in Crested Butte crossed her mind, but she'd seen the news reports. A housing crisis had flooded the shelters beyond capacity. Families were sleeping in their cars in grocery store parking lots. Single women were being turned away nightly. Claire scrolled further back in her contacts and stopped at a name she hadn't thought about in years. Margaret Chen, a college roommate who'd moved to Seattle. She hovered over the call button, then stopped. Margaret had 3 kids now, a mortgage, a life full to bursting. What could she even say? Can I sleep on your couch for a few months while I figure out how my husband legally stole everything I built? She locked her phone and stared out at the mountains. Dead Bear Bluff rose in the distance, a jagged ridge of limestone and pine that locals avoided. Too remote, too unstable. Her grandfather's land. The memories surfaced, slowly at first, then all at once. Raymond Boone, her mother's father, tall and lean, with hands like gnarled tree roots. He'd died when Claire was 16, and in his will he had left her a parcel of land he'd inherited from his own father. 15 acres of scrub and rock on Dead Bear Bluff, too steep for cattle, too far from the road for development. Her mother had paid the property taxes on it for years out of obligation, and after her mother's death, Claire had continued the tradition. $73 a year to keep a piece of land nobody wanted. She pulled out her phone again and searched her email for the last tax notice. There it was, 15 acres. Dead Bear Bluff assessed value $1,200, worthless in every practical sense. But Claire remembered something else. A summer day, when she was 9 years old, her grandfather driving her up a rutted logging road in his ancient pickup truck. He'd taken her hiking through the pines, pointing out animal tracks and edible plants, and then he'd shown her the cave. A massive limestone cavern carved into the side of the mountain, its entrance a jagged mouth about 18 feet wide and 12 feet high. She'd been terrified and fascinated in equal measure. Raymond had crouched beside her at the entrance, one weathered hand on her shoulder. "This land keeps secrets, Claire Bear. Someday you might need one." She'd laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to her grandfather's cryptic way of talking. But now, sitting in a rusted Bronco with nowhere to go and winter closing in, those words echoed differently. Claire started the engine and turned toward the mountain. The logging road was worse than she remembered. Overgrown and rutted, barely wide enough for the Bronco, it climbed steeply through dense stands of pine and aspen. Branches scraped the sides of the truck. Twice she had to get out and move fallen logs. By the time she reached the clearing where her grandfather used to park, the sun was low and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. She stepped out into the silence. No traffic noise, no voices, no hum of civilization, just wind through the trees and the distant cry of a hawk. The cave entrance was exactly where she remembered it, a dark wound in the hillside, partially hidden by scrub oak and boulders. Claire approached slowly the way she had as a child, half expecting something to leap out. But there was nothing, just cool air flowing from the darkness, carrying the smell of damp earth and old leaves. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, stepping inside. The cave stretched back into the mountain, the ceiling rising to nearly 20 feet in places before narrowing again. The walls were rough limestone, ancient and solid. She walked deeper, her footsteps echoing until she reached the back, roughly 55 feet from the entrance. A vertical fissure ran up through the ceiling, a natural chimney. Near the far wall, tucked into a niche, she found something that made her heart skip. A metal toolbox, rusted but intact. She knelt and pried it open. Inside were old canning jars, a hand-cranked lantern that no longer worked, and a leather journal wrapped in oilcloth. Claire carefully unwrapped the journal. The leather was stiff and cracked, the pages yellowed. On the first page, in her grandfather's blocky handwriting, Raymond Boone, 1934. She sat cross-legged on the stone floor and began to read. Her grandfather had lived in this cave during the Great Depression. The entries were sparse but detailed. He described sealing the entrance with salvaged lumber and tarps, building a stone fireplace near the back, hauling water from a spring. There were sketches, crude but clear, showing how he'd channeled smoke through the vertical fissure, how he'd insulated the walls with pine boughs and mud. One entry stood out. Temperature outside 15 degrees. Inside the cave, once sealed and with fire burning, hold steady at 65. The earth protects what man cannot. Claire closed the journal and looked around with new eyes. The cave wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a blueprint for survival. She spent the night in the Bronco, parked in the clearing, wrapped in every piece of clothing she'd thrown into her duffel bag. Sleep came in fragments interrupted by wind and the creaking of tree branches. When dawn broke cold and gray, she drove back down the mountain to face what she had to do. The Crested Butte Public Library opened at 8. Claire was waiting outside. She spent 4 hours on a public computer researching everything she could find about cave dwelling, geothermal temperature, ventilation, water filtration, solar power. She filled a notebook with sketches and calculations, her hand cramping from writing. By noon, she had a plan. It was insane. It was desperate. It was the only option she had. Garrison's salvage yard sat on the outskirts of Gunnison, a sprawling lot of rusted metal stacked lumber and decommissioned industrial equipment. Claire had driven past it 100 times but never stopped. Now she pulled into the gravel parking area and stepped out into the smell of diesel and old iron. A man emerged from a corrugated metal office, wiping his hands on a rag. He was in his late 60s, lean and weathered, with a gray beard and eyes that had seen too much. A faded Marine Corps tattoo showed on his forearm. "Help you," his voice was gruff but not unkind. Claire hesitated, suddenly aware of how she must look: exhausted, disheveled, desperate. "I need building materials. I don't have much money." The man studied her for a long moment. "What are you building?" "A home." Something shifted in his expression. He gestured for her to follow him into the yard. They walked past rows of salvaged doors, stacks of cinder blocks, and piles of scrap metal. He stopped at a section near the back where 2 heavy steel doors leaned against a shipping container. Pulled these out of a meat packing plant in Delta before they demolished it. 3-inch insulated steel heavy-duty hinges, rated for walk-in freezers. He rapped his knuckles against one. "Sound as the day they were made." Claire ran her hand over the cold metal. "How much?" "1,200 for the pair." Her heart sank. She didn't respond, just stared at the doors. The man watched her. "You got a name?" "Claire Hartwell." His expression changed. "Hartwell, your maiden name Boone." She looked up surprised. "My mother's name? How did you?" "Raymond Boone saved my life in Korea." The man extended his hand. "Frank Garrison." Claire shook at her mind, reeling. Frank crossed his arms, looking at her with new intensity. "I heard about what happened. Small-town word travels. Your husband's got a big mouth, especially when he's buying rounds at the Lucky Horseshoe." Shame burned in Claire's chest. Everyone knew. Of course they did. Frank spat into the dirt. "I knew Raymond. Best man I ever served with. Took a bullet meant for me outside Pyongyang, kept fighting with a hole in his shoulder. When he got home, he never talked about it, never asked for anything. Just lived quiet up on that mountain." He looked at Claire hard. "He left you that land, didn't he?" "Yes." "And you're going to live there?" It wasn't a question. Claire nodded. Frank was quiet for a moment, then he turned and started walking. "Come on." He led her through the yard, pointing out materials. A pallet of cinder blocks, slightly chipped but solid. A cast iron wood stove with a cracked door that still sealed tight. Rolls of fiberglass insulation. Sheets of Mylar emergency blankets. PVC piping. A hand-crank water pump. 2 heavy-duty marine batteries. 2 solar panels with surface scratches but intact cells. "You're going to need help installing some of this," Frank said. "My son Marcus used to be a structural engineer before he got tired of office politics. He's working here now. He'll help you with the technical stuff: doors, chimneys, solar setup." Claire's voice cracked. "I can't afford to pay him." "Didn't ask you to. You can settle up another way. My books are a mess since my wife passed. If you can keep records straight and cook a decent meal for the crew a few times a week, we'll call it even." Tears stung Claire's eyes. "Why are you doing this?" Frank looked toward the mountains. "Because Raymond would have done it for my kid. And because men like your husband need to learn that throwing people away don't make them strong. It just shows what they are." He turned back to her. "How much you got in your pocket?" $403. Give me 400. That'll cover the tax and hauling. The following morning, Frank's truck rumbled up the logging road, pulling a flatbed trailer loaded with materials. Behind him came a second truck driven by a younger man with Frank's build but darker hair, Marcus Garrison, 35, with calloused hands and the quiet competence of someone who'd built things his entire life. They spent the first hour just walking the site. Marcus examined the cave entrance, the vertical fissure, the terrain. He made notes on a yellow pad and asked Claire questions about her plans. She showed him her grandfather's journal. Marcus read it carefully, then looked up at the cave with something like respect. Your grandfather knew what he was doing. Geothermal principle Earth temperature stays constant, about 10 feet down, roughly 52 degrees year-round in this region. Once you seal the entrance and add a heat source, the stone walls will radiate warmth. The vertical fissure is perfect for a chimney if we do it right. He sketched a quick diagram. We'll build a cinder block wall across the entrance, leave a gap for the door. I'll fabricate a frame for the steel door. Make sure it's weather-tight. We'll run the stovepipe up through the fissure. I'll need to make a custom collar to seal it where it exits the ceiling. For the floor, we'll build raised platforms from pallets to keep you off the stone. Moisture rises, you'll want airflow underneath. Frank was already unloading cinder blocks. Talk less, work more. They worked from dawn until dusk. Claire mixed mortar using water from the spring Marcus had located about 40 feet from the cave entrance. Cold, clear flowing year-round from a crack in the hillside. She hauled blocks. She learned to lay them in staggered courses, checking level with a borrowed tool. Her hands blistered, then bled, then calloused. Marcus handled the technical work. He built a frame for the steel door using salvaged I-beams, anchoring it deep into the stone with expansion bolts and epoxy. He fabricated a stovepipe collar from sheet metal, sealing it into the vertical fissure with high-temperature silicone and fireproof cement. He showed Claire how to install the hand crank pump at the spring, how to run PVC pipe into the cave and into a filter basin he had constructed from a food-grade plastic drum. Frank worked alongside them, his movements economical and practiced. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was to teach. How to read the weather by watching the clouds over the peaks. How to split firewood so it dried faster. How to bank a fire so it lasted through the night. The work was brutal. Claire's muscles screamed. She woke each morning so stiff she could barely move. But each day the wall grew higher, the door frame more solid, the systems more complete. On the 15th day, they installed the steel door. It took all three of them to lift it into place to secure it to the frame with heavy-duty hinges and a deadbolt that could be locked from inside. When it finally swung shut with a solid thunk sealing out the world, Claire felt something shift inside her chest. Marcus spent the next week on the solar installation. He climbed the cliffside above the cave entrance with ropes and anchor, bolting the two panels to a south-facing rock face where they'd catch maximum sun. He ran wiring down through a small hole he drilled near the door, connected the panels to a charge controller, then to the marine batteries. He wired a series of LED lanterns throughout the cave, giving Claire light at the flip of a switch. By the end of November, the cave was livable. The cinder block wall stood solid across the entrance, insulated on the inside with layers of mylar blankets and fiberglass batting. The steel door hung plumb and sealed tight. The wood stove crouched near the back wall, its pipe running up through the fissure, a faint curl of smoke visible from outside when Claire fired it. She'd built raised sleeping platforms from pallets, laying a salvaged mattress on top. She'd organized her few belongings on shelves Marcus had built from scrap lumber. The water system worked, turned the hand pump at the spring, and filtered water flowed into the basin inside the cave. The solar panels charged the batteries during the day, and the LED lights turned night into something manageable. On the first day of December, Marcus and Frank stood with Claire at the cave entrance surveying their work. Marcus handed her a small notebook. I wrote down maintenance schedules, checked the solar connections monthly, cleaned the stovepipe every 6 weeks. The battery terminals need to be tightened once a year. Water filter needs replacing every 3 months. I left you extras. Frank clapped her on the shoulder. You did good, kid. Raymond would be proud. Claire's throat tightened. I don't know how to thank you. Stay alive, Frank said. That's thanks enough. They drove away as the sun dipped behind the mountains, leaving Claire alone in the growing darkness. She stepped inside the cave and closed the steel door, sliding the deadbolt home. The sound echoed in the stone chamber. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. She was sealed in, alone, cut off from everything. Then she fired up the wood stove. Within an hour, the temperature inside the cave climbed from 52 degrees to 68. The stone walls radiated gentle warmth. The LED lights pushed back the shadows. The sound of wind outside became muffled, distant, irrelevant. Claire sat on her platform bed wrapped in a wool blanket and opened a can of stew she'd bought in bulk from the grocery outlet. It was cheap and bland, but it was warm. She was warm. She was safe. She pulled out the journal she'd started keeping, a spiral notebook from the dollar store, and wrote her first entry. December 1st, I am not dead. I am not defeated. I am here, and this is mine. Down in the valley, a different kind of construction was underway. Derek and Vanessa had wasted no time transforming the farmhouse. What Claire had spent 10 years carefully restoring, they gutted in a matter of weeks. The load-bearing timber walls that had held the structure for over a century were torn out, replaced with steel I-beams hidden behind drywall. The entire southern face of the house was opened up, floor-to-ceiling windows installed to capture the view of the valley. Joe Brennan, a local contractor in his late 50s who'd worked on half the houses in Gunnison County, stood in the construction zone shaking his head. He held a clipboard and a pen, checking off items on Vanessa's design specifications. These windows aren't rated for this elevation, he said, not for the first time. Vanessa looked up from her tablet where she was reviewing a 3D rendering of the finished project. She wore expensive jeans and a cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. They're double-pane tempered glass from a top manufacturer. They'll be fine. Ma'am, with all respect, this is alpine country. We get sustained winds over 60 miles per hour, temperature swings of 80 degrees in a day. These windows are rated for coastal California conditions. You need impact-resistant glass with a higher wind load rating. Derek stepped in, his tone smooth and dismissive. Joe, we appreciate your concern, but Vanessa's an architect. She's run the engineering calculations. We're good. Joe looked at Derek, then at Vanessa, then back at his clipboard. He'd been in construction long enough to know when clients weren't going to listen. I'll note it in the file, but when the insurance adjuster asks questions later, I'm going to point back to this conversation. There won't be any questions, Vanessa said coolly, because there won't be any problems. Joe didn't argue further. He finished the installation and moved on to the next job, but he made sure every concern was documented and signed off by the homeowners. Derek stood in what had once been the living room, now a massive open space with 20-foot ceilings and glass walls overlooking the valley. Vanessa moved through the space like she was choreographing a photo shoot, framing angles with her hands. This is going to be an architectural digest, she said. I can see the spread now. Modern, rustic, reimagined high-altitude design meets minimalist luxury. Derek smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. The renovation had cost more than he'd expected. Much more. The budget Vanessa had drawn up had been optimistic at best, deceptive at worst. Every week brought new expenses, custom fixtures, imported tile, designer lighting. The boutique generator she'd insisted on, a sleek California brand marketed as ultra-quiet luxury model, had cost twice what a standard industrial unit would have. But every time Derek questioned a cost, Vanessa would look at him with those sharp green eyes and say something like, do you want this to look like every other mountain house, or do you want it to be iconic? And Derek, who had spent 12 years feeling ordinary next to Claire's quiet competence, wanted to be iconic. They scheduled a housewarming party for Thanksgiving, inviting investors from Vanguard Development and influential people from Denver's real estate scene. Vanessa hired a catering company. Derek ordered champagne. The house was still unfinished in places, but the main living area was complete, and it was stunning. The party was everything Derek had imagined. 50 guests circulating through the space, Champagne glasses, catching the light, everyone admiring the views and the design. Vanessa held court near the floating gas fireplace, a sleek modern unit that had replaced the old masonry hearth Claire had painstakingly restored, explaining her vision for sustainable modern alpine architecture. Derek noticed Carl Morrison standing near the window studying the glass with a slight frown. Carl was in his 60s, a retired structural engineer who'd made a fortune in Denver commercial development. He'd invested $50,000 in Vanguard development, and Derek needed him to invest more. Derek approached with a fresh glass of champagne. "Carl, what do you think?" Carl tapped at the glass with his knuckle, listening to the sound it made. "Beautiful space. Really stunning sightlines." He paused. "What's the wind rating on these panels?" Derek's smile tightened. "Vanessa handled all the specifications. They're top of the line." "I'm sure they are. It's just I've done projects in Vail and Aspen, and we always spec'd for sustained winds of 90 miles per hour minimum. These look like standard commercial tempered glass, maybe 60, 70 mile per hour rating." He took a sip of champagne. "But I'm sure she checked." "Of course," Derek said, his voice a little too bright. "She's a licensed architect." Carl nodded slowly. "Good, good." He didn't look convinced. Later that night, after the guests had left and Vanessa had gone to bed, Derek found himself standing alone in front of the glass wall, staring out at the darkened valley. In the distance, he could just make out the ridge of Dead Bear Bluff, a jagged shadow against the stars. He wondered briefly if Claire was up there somewhere, if she was cold, if she was hungry, if she'd found somewhere to stay. Then he pushed the thought away and poured himself another drink. December arrived with the first serious cold snap. Temperatures dropped to 15 below zero. The heating system in Derek's renovated farmhouse ran constantly, and the monthly bill came to $890. Derek stared at the number on his laptop screen, his stomach tightening. Vanessa was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone. "We should host a New Year's party," she said. "Really launch Vanguard into 2024. Derek didn't respond. He was looking at the Vanguard development accounts. The company had 3 projects lined up, but all of them were contingent on securing additional investment, and the renovation costs on the farmhouse had eaten through most of Derek's liquid capital. He'd taken out a second mortgage, one Vanessa didn't know about, just to cover the overruns. His phone buzzed. A text from Preston Wade, the lawyer. "Need to discuss the farmhouse title? Call me." Derek's chest tightened. He'd been avoiding Preston's calls for 2 weeks. He stood and grabbed his coat. "I'm going to town. Need to pick up a few things." Vanessa didn't look up from her phone. "Grab some of that Italian bread from the bakery, the one with rosemary." Derek drove into Gunnison and met Preston at a coffee shop. The lawyer's expression was grim. "The title's not as clean as we thought," Preston said, sliding a folder across the table. "There's a lien from the original restoration work Claire did. The contractor filed it 3 years ago when you were late on a payment. You settled it eventually, but the lien was never formally released. If Claire wanted to make trouble—" "She can't afford a lawyer," Derek interrupted. Preston raised an eyebrow. "Maybe not, but if she finds someone willing to work pro bono, or if she files a complaint with the state, it could tie up the property for months. You wouldn't be able to sell or refinance." Derek felt sweat prickle on his forehead. "What do I need to do?" "Get her to sign a release. It's a simple form. I'll draw it up, but you'll have to find her." Derek nodded slowly, though his mind was racing. He hadn't seen Claire since the day she'd driven away. He didn't know where she was, didn't want to know, but now he needed to. Up on Dead Bear Bluff, Claire had no idea any of this was happening. She was too busy surviving. Her days had fallen into a rhythm. Wake at dawn, fire up the stove, boil water for coffee and oatmeal, check the solar panels for snow or debris, pump fresh water from the spring, spend the morning working on bookkeeping for Garrison's salvage yard on her laptop using the satellite internet Marcus had helped her install. In the afternoon, she'd chop firewood or make repairs or read. Evenings were for cooking simple meals and writing in her journal. The cave had become something more than shelter. It was a fortress, a cocoon, a place where the outside world couldn't reach her. She'd hung mylar blankets on the walls to reflect heat, built additional shelving from scrap lumber, created a small indoor garden under LED, grow lights herbs and lettuce that grew slowly but steadily. She'd even fashioned a crude shower system using a gravity-fed bladder and a tarp curtain. On the rare occasions she drove down to town for supplies, she felt the stares. People whispered. Crazy Claire living in a hole in the dirt. She'd heard it more than once, though never directly to her face. One afternoon in mid-December, she stopped at the Mad Moose Diner for a cup of coffee to go. The place was half full, locals hunched over plates of eggs and hash browns. Conversation quieted when she walked in. She ordered at the counter, keeping her eyes forward. Behind her, she heard a woman's voice deliberately loud enough to carry. "I heard she's living in a cave like some kind of animal." A man's voice amused. "Derek dodged a bullet with that one. Always was a little off." Claire's hands tightened around the paper cup the waitress handed her. She paid left a tip and walked out without turning around. In the parking lot, she sat in the Bronco and took slow breaths. Her hands shook. Not from anger, though there was plenty of that. From something deeper. The loneliness of being erased. Of having your story rewritten by people who'd never cared to know you in the first place. She drove back up the mountain and sealed herself inside the cave. But this time when she closed the door, it felt less like safety and more like exile. The first major storm warning came on January 6th. The National Weather Service issued alerts across the entire Central Rockies. A massive low-pressure system was forming over the Pacific Northwest, pulling Arctic air down from Canada. Meteorologists were calling it Winter Storm Goliath. Sheriff Tom Braddock held an emergency meeting at the county building in Gunnison. Claire didn't attend, but she saw the news coverage on her laptop. Braddock stood at a podium, his expression grave. "Folks, this is the real deal. We're looking at sustained winds over 70 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to 40 below zero, and snowfall measured in feet, not inches. If you don't have a backup heat source, get one. If you don't have supplies for at least a week, stock up. Once this thing hits, we will not be able to respond to calls. You're on your own until it passes." Claire had already been preparing. She'd stocked 40 cans of soup and stew, 20 pounds of rice, 10 pounds of dried beans. She had medical supplies, batteries, candles. Marcus had delivered an extra cord of firewood the week before, and she'd stacked it inside the cave, protected from the elements. On January 8th, the day before Goliath was expected to hit, she made one last trip to town. The grocery store was chaos, shelves stripped bare. She managed to grab a few cans of vegetables and a bag of flour. At the hardware store, she bought an extra can of propane for the backup camp stove Marcus had insisted she keep. At the checkout counter, the clerk, a young guy she didn't recognize, looked at her curiously. "You're the one living up on Dead Bear Bluff, right?" Claire nodded, handing over cash. "You gonna be okay up there?" "I'll be fine." He bagged her items. "My granddad used to hunt up that way. He said there's caves in those hills." "There are." The clerk handed her the bag and lowered his voice. "For what it's worth, I think what you're doing is brave. My girlfriend and I are stuck in a studio with no heat backup. If we had a cave, we'd take it." It was the first kind thing anyone in town had said to her in weeks. Claire felt her throat tighten. "Stay warm. You too." She drove back up the mountain for the last time before Goliath arrived. The sky was already changing a strange pale color that made the mountains look sharp and ominous. Inside the cave, Claire checked everything twice. The door seal, the stove, the water supply, the batteries. She stacked extra firewood near the stove. She filled every container she had with water, just in case the spring froze. As the sun set, she stood outside for a moment, looking down at the valley. Lights twinkled in the distance, houses, towns, lives carrying on. Somewhere down there, Derek and Vanessa were probably preparing too, though she doubted they understood what was coming. The wind was already picking up, carrying the smell of snow. Claire stepped back inside, closed the steel door, and slid the deadbolt home. The sound echoed in the stone chamber. She was sealed in. Safe. Ready. She sat on her bed platform wrapped in a wool blanket and opened her journal. The LED light cast a warm glow. The stove crackled softly. Outside, the wind began to howl. She wrote January 8th, "The storm is coming. I am not afraid." Winter came to Dead Bear Bluff with a silence that felt alive. Claire woke on January 9th to a stillness so complete it pressed against her eardrums. No wind, no bird song, just the faint crackle of embers in the wood stove and the steady drip of water from the filter basin. She checked the thermometer mounted near the door. Outside, temperature -12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cave, 54 degrees, and the stove hadn't been fed in hours. The earth itself was keeping her warm. Claire added 2 logs to the stove and watched the flames catch copper light dancing across limestone walls. She'd been in the cave for 6 weeks now, and the routines had become automatic. Pump water, check batteries, ration food, the life she'd had before dinner parties and Netflix binaries and worrying about thread count felt like something from a book she'd read long ago. She boiled water for instant coffee and powered up her laptop. Frank had asked her to reconcile December's accounts for the salvage yard, and the work gave her morning structure. But when she opened her email, the internet connection was spotty. The storm must be interfering with the satellite signal. By 10 in the morning, the wind arrived. It started as a low moan that grew into a sustained howl. Claire stepped outside briefly to check the solar panels. The sky had turned the color of old bruises clouds, moving so fast they seemed to boil. The temperature had dropped another 15 degrees in 2 hours. She secured everything she could, tightened the tarp over her firewood stack, double-checked the door hinges, made sure the chimney cap was clear. Snowflakes were already falling small and hard as rice grains driven nearly horizontal by the wind. Back inside, she sealed the door and listened. The wind hammered against the cinder block wall, but the sound was muffled distant. The cave absorbed it the way water absorbs a stone. She felt a flicker of gratitude toward her grandfather, toward Frank and Marcus, toward whatever stubborn gene had made her choose this instead of surrender. The storm intensified through the afternoon. By evening, the temperature outside had plummeted to -38 degrees. Claire monitored it through a wireless sensor Marcus had installed the readout displaying on a small screen inside. The wind speed peaked at 78 miles per hour. Inside, the temperature held at 66 degrees. The stove radiated its steady warmth. The LED lights never flickered. Claire heated a can of beef stew and ate it slowly, sitting cross-legged on her bed platform with a book propped on her knees. Outside, the world was ending. Inside, she was reading about the history of the American frontier. She thought about Derek briefly, wondered if he was warm, if the expensive glass walls were holding, if Vanessa was frightened. Then she turned the page and kept reading. Down in the valley, Derek's architectural dream was fracturing. The power had gone out at 6 in the evening, the grid collapsing under the weight of ice and wind. Derek had anticipated this. The boutique generator sat in a custom-built enclosure on the north side of the property, sleek and nearly silent when it ran. But it wouldn't start. Derek stood in the snow, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight, frantically pressing the ignition button. The generator made a weak clicking sound, then nothing. He tried again. And again. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. "What's wrong with it?" "I don't know, it's not turning over." The temperature inside the house was already dropping. The radiant floor heating had died with the power, and the backup gas fireplace required electricity to ignite. Derek's fingers were going numb. He pulled out his phone to search for troubleshooting guides, but the screen showed no service. Cell towers were down. He tried the landline. Dead. Vanessa's voice rose tight with panic. "Derek, it's -40 degrees outside. We can't stay here without heat." "I know that." He kicked the generator housing, immediately regretting it as pain shot through his foot. "Help me clear the snow around it. Maybe the intake vent is blocked." They dug frantically, throwing snow aside with their bare hands until their fingers burned. But the vents were clear. The problem was internal. The ultra-quiet luxury model Vanessa had insisted on was designed for mild California climates. its engine oil too thick to turn over in extreme cold. Back inside, Derek layered every blanket he could find over the bed. They huddled together in the master bedroom, watching their breath form clouds. The floor-to-ceiling windows that had looked so stunning during the housewarming party now felt like walls of ice. Frost was forming on the inside of the glass. Vanessa pulled out her phone, though it was useless. "This is insane. We need to call someone." "Oh, there's no one to call. The sheriff said all emergency services are suspended until the storm passes. So we're just supposed to freeze." Derek didn't answer. He was staring at the windows, watching the way they shuddered each time a gust hit. The wind was getting stronger. The house groaned around them, beams flexing glass, rattling in frames. At 2:17 in the morning, the window exploded. The sound was like a grenade detonating. Derek jerked awake from a fitful half-sleep to find the bedroom filled with driving snow and air so cold it seared his lungs. Vanessa was screaming. Glass covered the bed, glittering in the beam of his flashlight. A massive oak branch lay in the middle of the room, surrounded by shattered fragments of the southern window wall. The wind roared through the opening, a living thing trying to tear the house apart from the inside. Derek stumbled out of bed, his mind blank with shock. The temperature was already plummeting. -42 outside, and now there was no barrier between outside and in. Vanessa grabbed his arm, her nails digging through his sleeve. "We have to block it." They tried, dragged furniture toward the opening, threw blankets, shoved a mattress against the gap. But the wind ripped everything away, sent it tumbling across the room. Snow poured in like water from a broken dam. The house was dying around them. Derek's thoughts crystallized into a single terrible clarity. They had maybe 4 hours before hypothermia shut down their organs. The roads were impassable. The cars were buried. Cell phones dead. No one was coming, except there was one place, one shelter within reach. He grabbed Vanessa's shoulders, shouting over the wind, "We have to leave, now." "Leave? Are you insane? Where would we go?" "Claire's land. The cave. It's 2.5 miles up the old logging trail." Vanessa's face went white. "I'm not crawling to that." "Then you'll be dead by dawn." Derek was already moving, pulling on every layer he could find. Thermal underwear, jeans, 2 sweaters, his ski jacket, gloves, a scarf wrapped over his face. Vanessa stared at him, then at the growing pile of snow on the bedroom floor. Her expression crumbled. She started grabbing clothes. They left through the back door, Max the golden retriever pressed between them. The storm hit like a physical blow. Wind knocked Derek sideways. Snow stung his exposed skin. The cold was so intense it felt like burning. The logging trail started behind the property line, marked by a weathered wooden post Derek had passed 1,000 times without thinking about. Now it was their only chance. He pushed forward, Vanessa clutching his jacket. Each step was a battle. The snow was already waist-deep in the drifts, chest swam in places. The trail was invisible, recognizable only by the gap between trees. 20 minutes in Derek's lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. His face had gone numb. He couldn't feel his feet anymore, just kept lifting them and pushing forward. Behind him, Vanessa was crying, though the tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. Max whined, his golden fur already crusted with ice. An hour passed, maybe more. Time stopped meaning anything. There was only wind and snow and the brutal arithmetic of survival. Each breath was a negotiation. Each step might be the last. Derek's mind began to fracture. He thought about Claire's face the day he'd handed over the keys, the flatness in her eyes. He thought about the farmhouse, how she bled to restore it, how he gutted it without a second thought. He thought about Vanessa's hand on his arm at industry conferences, the thrill of being wanted by someone who saw him as powerful instead of ordinary. None of it mattered now. The mountain didn't care about ambition or desire or betrayal. It only cared whether you were strong enough to survive it. 2 hours in, Vanessa fell. Derek pulled her up, but she could barely stand. Her lips were blue. She wasn't shivering anymore, the lethal stage where the body gives up trying to generate heat. Derek half carried, half dragged her. Max stayed close, his warmth a tiny anchor of life in the frozen wasteland. At 3 hours and 45 minutes, Derek's flashlight beam caught something dark against the white. A wall. Cinder blocks. He stumbled forward, his numb hands finding the smooth surface of steel. The door. He pounded on it with both fists, screaming for help. The wind tore his voice away. He collapsed against the metal, pulling Vanessa and Max down with him. His thoughts dissolved into a single repeating prayer. Please, please, please. This is justice, part of his mind whispered. You took her home. Now she'll watch you die at her door. He closed his eyes. Inside the cave, Claire was deep into a chapter about Lewis and Clark when she heard something that didn't fit. A rhythmic thudding, faint but persistent. She set the book down and listened. There it was again. Deliberate. Desperate. She grabbed the iron fire poker and approached the door, her heart hammering. Bears didn't knock. People shouldn't be out in this. She pressed her ear against the cold steel and heard it, a dog whining, and beneath that a voice so muffled she couldn't make out words. Her hand hovered over the deadbolt. She knew somehow, before she opened it, knew who would be on the other side. The universe had a sense of irony sharper than any knife. She could leave them, slide the bolt back into place, return to her book, let the storm handle what the courts never would. No one would ever know. By morning, they'd be buried under 10 feet of snow, erased. The thought lingered, dark and seductive. But Claire had spent 6 weeks in this cave learning who she was when everything else was stripped away. And she wasn't Derek. Survival didn't mean becoming a monster. It meant staying human when the world gave you every excuse not to be. She pulled the door open. The rush of cold was like a slap. Snow swirled into her sanctuary. Huddled against the threshold, covered in ice, were Derek and Vanessa, and a golden retriever she vaguely recognized from the driveway months ago. Derek looked up, his face a mask of frost and desperation. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Vanessa was semi-conscious, her skin the color of old wax. Claire didn't hesitate. Get inside, now. They crawled over the threshold, collapsing onto the stone floor. Claire slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. The cave plunged back into warm silence, the contrast so extreme that Vanessa began sobbing hysterically. Claire moved with clinical precision. She stripped their wet outer layers, fingers working quickly, despite the shock of seeing Derek's face again. Frostbite blackened the tips of his ears. Vanessa's hands were waxy white. Max shook violently, ice falling from his fur. She wrapped them in dry wool blankets and positioned them near the stove. Not too close, she'd learned about rewarming shock from her emergency preparedness research. Too much heat, too fast, and their blood vessels would burst. Derek tried to speak. Claire cut him off. Don't talk. Don't move. Sit still and breathe slowly. She heated water on the stove and made warm broth from bouillon cubes weak enough not to shock their systems. She held the cup to Vanessa's lips first, watching her swallow in small, painful sips. Then Derek. The dog she rubbed down with a towel, checking his paws for ice damage. He was in better shape than the humans, his fur having protected him. She gave him water and a handful of dry kibble she kept for emergencies. Only then did she allow herself to look at Derek properly. He stared back, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Why? Claire turned away and busied herself with the stove. Because I'm not you. The words hung in the warm air like a verdict. She pulled a spare blanket from her storage shelf and threw it to them. You stay in that corner. I stay here. You eat what I give you when I give it. You don't talk unless necessary. When the road's clear, you leave and you never contact me again. Understood? Derek nodded, too exhausted to argue. Vanessa had stopped crying. She sat wrapped in the blanket, staring around the cave with an expression Claire couldn't quite read. Horror, maybe, or shame. Claire checked the thermometer. Outside, -42. Inside, 68 degrees and holding. The storm hammered against the steel door, but the sound was muted, impotent. She returned to her bed platform and picked up her book, though the words swam in front of her eyes. Across the cave, Derek and Vanessa huddled together, two refugees in a kingdom they'd never expected to need. The first night passed in tense silence. Claire woke at dawn, though time was arbitrary in the cave's perpetual LED twilight, and fed the stove. Derek and Vanessa were still asleep, curled together like children. Max lay between them, his presence the only warm thing in the cold geometry of their arrangement. She made coffee for herself, the smell filling the cave. Neither of them stirred. Exhaustion had pulled them under. Claire opened her laptop and tried to check email, but the satellite connection was still down. The storm must be worse than anyone predicted. She pulled up her offline files and worked on Frank's books, losing herself in the rhythm of numbers. When Vanessa finally woke around mid-morning, she sat up slowly and looked around as if trying to remember where she was. Her gaze landed on Claire. "Is there a bathroom?" Claire pointed to a bucket in the far corner, partially hidden by a curtain she'd rigged from a tarp. "That's it. Toilet paper's in the box next to it." Vanessa's face went through several expressions before settling on resignation. She stood wobbled and made her way to the corner. Derek woke while she was gone. He sat up wincing and touched his ears gingerly. The frostbite had turned them a mottled purple black. Claire didn't look at him. "You'll probably lose the tips. Keep them clean. If they start to smell, that's gangrene. I have basic antibiotics in the first aid kit, but you'll need a hospital if it gets infected." "How long has it been snowing?" 18 hours, give or take. "When will it stop?" "Weather Service said 5 to 7 days before it clears. But that was before the internet went out, so who knows?" Derek's face went gray. "A week, maybe more." Vanessa returned her expression carefully blank. She settled back onto the blanket next to Derek without looking at Claire. The day crawled forward. Claire rationed out small portions of canned stew for lunch. One can split 3 ways. It was supposed to be 2 servings, but stretched to 3, it was barely enough. She ate hers slowly, making it last. Derek and Vanessa devoured theirs in minutes. She watched them from across the cave, these 2 people who had destroyed her life, now completely dependent on her charity. The irony was so sharp it could draw blood. Late in the afternoon, Derek stood and began exploring the cave. Claire didn't stop him. There wasn't much to see at her bed platform. The stove, the water basin shelves of canned goods and supplies, the small hydroponic garden under grow lights. He stopped at the shelf where she kept her journal and a few books. His hand reached out. "Don't." Claire's voice cut across the space. Derek froze. "I wasn't going to." "Yes, you were." He pulled his hand back and turned to face her. For the first time since arriving, there was something in his expression besides shock and fear. Guilt, maybe, or curiosity. "How did you build all this? Does it matter? I'm just trying to understand." Claire set down the piece of pine she'd been whittling. Marcus had taught her the basics, and it gave her hands something to do. "You want to understand, fine. I had $400 and nowhere to go. Frank Garrison, you remember him? The veteran who runs the salvage yard gave me materials at cost because my grandfather saved his life in Korea. His son Marcus helped me install the technical systems in exchange for bookkeeping and cooking. I worked 16-hour days for 8 weeks. My hands bled. I lost 15 pounds. I slept in my truck, but I didn't quit. That's how I built this." Derek was quiet for a long moment. "Then I didn't know it was that bad." "You didn't want to know." The truth of it settled between them like snow. Derek returned to his corner. Vanessa was watching them both, her sharp features unreadable. Night came again. Claire dimmed the LED lights to conserve battery power, leaving just enough to navigate by. The cave fell into shadows. She could hear Derek and Vanessa whispering to each other, though she couldn't make out the words. She lay on her bed platform and stared at the ceiling, watching the play of firelight across ancient limestone. Outside, the storm continued its assault. Inside, 3 people who shouldn't be alive waited for dawn. The second day brought a new tension. Derek woke early and approached Claire while Vanessa was still asleep. He stood a respectful distance away, shifting his weight like a nervous kid. "Claire, I need to ask you something." She didn't look up from the water she was boiling. "What?" "Did Preston ever contact you about signing a lien release?" Now she looked at him. "What are you talking about?" Derek's face reddened. "There's a There was a lien from some restoration work. It never got properly released. Preston said he was going to reach out to you, but I guess with everything, you need me to sign something so you can sell the house. It wasn't a question. Derek's silence was answer enough. Claire turned back to the stove, a bitter laugh escaping her throat. You stole my home, kicked me out with $400, and now you need my signature to profit from it. That's incredible. Even for you, Derek, that's incredible. I'm not asking you to get away from me. Derek retreated, but the knowledge hung in the air now, another weight added to the already crushing burden of their shared space. Later that morning, Claire heard Vanessa and Derek arguing in low, vicious tones. She tried not to listen, but the cave's acoustics made privacy impossible. Vanessa's voice sharp as glass. You said the windows were rated for this. You said the engineer approved everything. I trusted you. You're the architect. Don't put this on me. You signed off on every choice I made because you were too busy trying to impress investors. This is as much your fault as mine. We wouldn't even be in this mess if you hadn't insisted on that useless generator. Oh, so now it's my fault we're freezing to death. Maybe if you'd actually done your homework instead of just throwing money around. I threw money around. You're the one who wanted Italian marble and custom fixtures, and Claire stood abruptly, the scrape of wood against stone cutting through their argument. They both fell silent. She grabbed her coat and in the fire poker. I'm going outside to check the chimney. While I'm gone, you two can either shut up or kill each other. I don't care which. But if you're still fighting when I get back, you can both sleep outside tonight. She meant it. They heard it in her voice. Claire unsealed the door and stepped into the maelstrom. The cold hit like a fist. Snow had drifted against the entrance nearly to her waist. The wind still howled, though it had dropped from hurricane force to merely violent. She waded to where the chimney pipe emerged from the rock face, checking for ice blockage. It was clear. Smoke rose steadily, dispersing into the white chaos. She stood there longer than necessary, letting the cold scour away the anger. When she finally went back inside, Derek and Vanessa were sitting in opposite corners, not looking at each other. Claire sealed the door and went about her routine as if they didn't exist. The third day, Derek found her journal. Claire had gone to pump water at the springs. She'd rigged an extension of the PVC system so she could do this from inside during the storm. When she came back, Derek was sitting on her bed platform, the spiral notebook open in his hands. She dropped the water container. It hit the stone floor with a crack, water spreading in a dark stain. Derek looked up, his face stricken. Claire, She crossed the cave in 4 strides and ripped the journal from his hands. What the hell is wrong with you? I'm sorry, I saw it sitting there and that's private, that's mine. You don't get to take anything else from me. But the damage was done. She could see it in his eyes. He'd read the entries from those first terrible weeks, the ones where she'd documented every can of beans, every dollar spent, every night she'd cried herself to sleep in the Bronco. Derek's voice cracked. October 15th. You had $87 left. You ate 1 can of beans. That was all. Claire's hands shook. Stop. November 3rd, you saw us at the diner. We were laughing. You wrote, I said stop. But Derek was crying now, the kind of ugly tears that came from somewhere deep and broken. I didn't know, God. Claire, I didn't know it was this bad. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. She shoved the journal into her storage box and locked it with a padlock Marcus had given her. When she turned back, Derek was still sitting there, his face in his hands. Vanessa watched from her corner, her expression unreadable. Claire's voice came out flat, empty. You want absolution? You want me to tell you it's okay that you didn't mean it, that you're not really a monster? I can't give you that. What you did to me, what you both did. She looked at Vanessa now, who had the decency to look away. It broke something, and you don't get to feel better about it just because you stumbled into my cave and read my diary. Derek lifted his head. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to understand. I understand perfectly. You felt small, Vanessa made you feel big. You wanted what I built, but didn't want me attached to it, so you took it. End of story. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek stood slowly and walked back to his corner. He curled up in his blanket, facing the wall. That evening, as Claire portioned out dinner, the food was running lower than she'd planned for, and she quietly cut her own serving in half. Vanessa spoke for the first time all day. I knew. Claire looked up from the pot of stew. What about the remortgage? I knew from the beginning. Month 2, Derek told me what he was doing. I helped him hide the documents when you were out of town. Derek's head snapped around. Vanessa. Oh, shut up, Derek. She deserves the truth. Vanessa turned her sharp green eyes on Claire. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm innocent. You think I just happened to start a business with a married man? I knew exactly what I was doing. I saw an opportunity and I took it. Claire set down the spoon. Why are you telling me this? Because you're keeping us alive, and I'm tired of pretending. I'm a lot of things, but I'm not a coward. Yeah, I wanted the business. Yeah, I knew Derek was married. And yeah, when he said he could get capital from the house, I helped him do it. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just done lying. Derek stared at Vanessa like she'd grown a second head. You said you didn't know about the prenup loophole. You said, I lied, Derek. I lie a lot. It's kind of my thing. Vanessa's laugh was bitter. You really thought I partnered with you because I believed in your vision. You were a means to an end. Capital and connections. That's it. The truth detonated between them like the window had 3 nights before. Derek's face went through shock, betrayal, rage, and finally something worse, recognition. He was seeing himself reflected back, and the image was ugly. Claire ladled stew into 3 bowls and handed them out without comment. There was nothing to say. They ate in silence. That night, Claire lay awake listening to Derek's quiet crying from across the cave. Vanessa didn't comfort him. The golden retriever Max, she'd finally learned his name, padded over to Claire's platform and rested his head on the edge, looking up at her with soulful brown eyes. She scratched behind his ears. He at least was innocent in all this. The 4th day brought a shift. Vanessa, pragmatic to her core, seemed to accept their situation and began making herself useful. She asked Claire about the water system, about the solar setup, about the hydroponic garden. Claire answered in short sentences, but she answered. Derek withdrew further into himself. He sat in his corner for hours staring at nothing. Around noon, Claire noticed she was getting dizzy when she stood up too quickly. She'd been cutting her portions for 2 days now, giving Derek and Vanessa more. They were both bigger than her, needed more calories to maintain body heat, but her own reserves were running low. She drank extra water to fill her stomach and tried not to think about it. That afternoon, Derek emerged from his fugue state long enough to notice Claire swaying slightly as she added wood to the stove. When did you last eat? This morning. No, I mean really eat. A full portion. Claire didn't answer. She didn't need to. Derek picked up his bowl half full of the stew from lunch and held it out. Take this. I'm fine. Claire, you're starving yourself to keep us alive. Please, take it. She looked at the bowl, then at his face. Saw something she hadn't seen in years, genuine concern without calculation behind it. I said I'm fine, but she took the bowl. The 5th day, the wind finally began to die. Claire woke to a quality of silence that felt different from the muffled roar they'd grown accustomed to. When she checked the outdoor sensor, the wind had dropped to 30 miles per hour. Still dangerous, but not apocalyptic. The temperature outside was -28. Inside 69 degrees. She allowed herself a small spark of hope. Another day or two and the storm might break. Derek approached her while she was checking the battery levels on the solar system. His frostbitten ears had scabbed over the dead tissue, turning black. He'd need medical attention soon, but he'd probably keep them. Claire, can we talk? Really talk? She didn't look up from the voltage meter. About what? About everything, about what I did. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I see it now. What I destroyed, who I became. He paused. Vanessa was right. I felt small next to you. You were so competent, so focused. You could fix anything, build anything. And I just sold software, went to an office, made spreadsheets. I told myself I was the breadwinner, that I was supporting your dream, but really I was just jealous. Claire set down the meter and finally looked at him. And that justified stealing from me. No, nothing justifies it. I'm not trying to justify it. I'm trying to explain. He ran a hand through his greasy hair. When I met Vanessa, she treated me like I was important, like my ideas mattered. She had this development project, and she said I'd be perfect to lead it. Me, not support staff, not the money guy, the leader. And I wanted that so badly I convinced myself I deserved it. That you'd be fine, that you didn't really need the house or the money because you were so capable you'd land on your feet. And did I? Derek looked around the cave. Yeah, you did. But that doesn't make what I did okay. You shouldn't have had to. Claire felt something crack in her chest, but she wasn't sure if it was anger or grief or just exhaustion. You're right, I shouldn't have had to. But you know what's worse than the theft, Derek? The loneliness. You made me a joke. Crazy Claire living in a hole. You rewrote our whole story so you were the hero escaping a weird wife. And people believed it. Because it's easier to believe the woman is crazy than the man is cruel. Derek flinched. I know. I heard what people said at the Lucky Horseshoe. I never corrected them. I let them think. His voice broke. I'm sorry. I know it's not enough. It'll never be enough. But I'm sorry. Claire stood. You're sorry because you need me. Because the universe dropped you on my doorstep and I could have let you die. Don't mistake gratitude for growth, Derek. Don't mistake fear for enlightenment. She walked away, leaving him standing alone by the battery bank. But something had shifted. Not forgiveness she wasn't ready for, that might never be, but acknowledgement. The truth had been spoken aloud, witness made real. It would have to be enough. The sixth day the storm broke. Claire woke to sunlight, actual sunlight, filtering through the small gaps around the doorframe. The wind had stopped. The temperature outside had climbed to -15, practically balmy by comparison. She opened the door carefully, pushing against the drift of snow that had piled against it. The world outside was transformed. Everything buried under 10 feet of pristine white. The sun reflected off it with such intensity she had to squint. The sky was the deep, impossible blue that only came after major storms, not a cloud in sight. Derek and Vanessa appeared behind her, staring at the landscape with shell-shocked expressions. We need to dig out, Claire said. Rescue teams will be working in the valley first. Could be 2 or 3 days before they make it up here. They spent the morning clearing a path to where the Bronco was buried, more for something to do than any real hope of driving. The logging trail would be impassable for weeks. Around noon they heard it, the distant whine of snowmobile engines. Claire scrambled to the highest point she could reach and waved her arms. 3 snowmobiles appeared from the tree line, their riders in bright rescue gear. Sheriff Braddock pulled up first, cutting his engine. He was a solid man in his 50s, with a weathered face and intelligent eyes. He looked at Claire, then passed her at Derek and Vanessa emerging from the cave entrance. Well, I'll be damned. We found the Hartwell place completely destroyed, roof caved in. Thought for sure we'd be recovering bodies. Derek stepped forward. We made it here. Claire saved us. Braddock looked between them, clearly doing the math. The wife who'd been kicked out, the husband who'd kicked her, the storm that had equalized everything. How long you been up here? Claire kept her voice even. I've been living here since October. They arrived the night the windows blew out. One of the other rescuers, a younger deputy, whistled low. 6 days in a cave, that's something. Braddock's gaze sharpened on Claire. You built this yourself. Had help from Frank Garrison and his son. But yeah. Respect flickered across Braddock's weathered features, the kind you couldn't fake. Frank's good people. Glad he was there for you. He radioed to base camp that all 3 subjects were alive. An ambulatory requested medical evac for frostbite assessment. Then he turned to Claire. Media's going to want this story. Wife saves husband who threw her out. It's got a certain poetry to it. Claire's stomach tightened. I'd rather not. I'll do what I can to keep your name out of it, but you should know there's already reporters in Gunnison asking questions about the destroyed farmhouse and who owned it. This is going to get out. The ride down the mountain took an hour on the snowmobiles. Claire rode behind one of the deputies, watching her cave disappear behind the trees. A small part of her didn't want to leave. The world down below, with its gossip and judgment, and Derek's lingering presence, felt heavier than the mountain ever had. At the base camp, paramedics checked them over. Derek's frostbite was second degree, but not severe enough for hospitalization. Vanessa had mild hypothermia that had already resolved. Claire was dehydrated and underweight, but otherwise fine. A reporter from the local paper approached while Claire was accepting a bottle of water from a volunteer. The woman was young, eager, holding a voice recorder. Ms. Hartwell, Sarah Martinez, Gunnison Chronicle. Can I ask you a few questions about... Sheriff Braddock stepped between them. Not now, Sarah. Give the woman some space. Sarah persisted. The public has a right to know, and she has a right to medical privacy and a hot meal. Back off. The reporter retreated, but Claire saw her cornering Derek near the medical tent. Saw Vanessa standing alone by one of the rescue vehicles, arms crossed, looking small and lost. Frank Garrison arrived in his pickup an hour later. He found Claire sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket, staring at nothing. He sat down beside her without asking. They were quiet for a long moment. Marcus wants to know if your solar panel survived. Claire managed a weak smile. Tell him they're fine. You coming back down to the valley? Got a spare room at my place if you need it. She shook her head. I'm going back to the cave as soon as they clear the road. Frank nodded like he'd expected that. Storm like this, it shows you what matters, what's real and what's just paint overwrought. Claire looked at him. Derek's house was the paint, and your cave's the real thing, built on stone, not sand. Frank patted her shoulder and stood. You need anything, you call, and ignore whatever garbage people say. They weren't up there. They don't know. But people did say garbage. By evening, the story had hit regional news. The irony was too perfect to resist. Betrayed wife builds cave fortress, saves cheating husband when his glass palace shatters. It spread to social media, then to national outlets, looking for human interest stories from the historic blizzard. Claire's phone, which she'd turned off days ago, blew up with messages when she finally powered it on. Friend requests from strangers, interview requests from podcasts and magazines. Messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly concerned about her well-being. And one message from Derek. I meant what I said. I'm sorry, I know that's not enough. It'll never be enough. She deleted it without responding. The insurance adjuster arrived at what remained of Derek's farmhouse 3 days after the rescue. Claire heard about it from Frank, who heard it from Joe Brennan, who'd been called in to assess structural integrity for the demolition crew. The adjuster was a woman named Patricia Voss, mid-40s, with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen every kind of disaster, claim fraud attempted. She walked the ruins with a clipboard and a camera documenting everything. The collapsed roof, the shattered glass wall, the expensive fixtures buried under snow and debris. Joe stood beside her, pointing out details. See here, these are the original load-bearing timbers cut away. Building codes for this elevation require either steel reinforcement or double joists when you remove structural elements. Neither was done. Patricia photographed the exposed beams and the windows, standard tempered glass, rated for maybe 70-mile-per-hour winds in a controlled environment. We get gusts over 90 up here regularly, plus thermal shock from temperature swings. I documented my concerns before installation. Homeowner signed off anyway. Patricia made notes. Who was the architect? Vanessa Cole out of Denver. She provided stamped drawings, but... Joe hesitated. Between you and me, those calculations use coastal wind loads. Wrong climate zone entirely. The claim denial came through in a week. Gross negligence. Failure to meet building codes. Material misrepresentation of structural capacity. Derek's policy covered acts of God, but not acts of stupidity dressed up as design. The mortgage was still due. $380,000 on a pile of frozen rubble worth maybe $20,000 as salvage. Claire learned all this from the Gunnison Chronicle article that ran under the headline, Glasshouse Shatters Blizzard Exposes Risky Renovation. The reporter Sarah Martinez had done her homework. She'd interviewed Joe Brennan, obtained copies of the permit applications, even found the emails where Vanessa had overridden Joe's recommendations to save money on materials. Derek declined to comment. Vanessa couldn't be reached. She'd left for Denver 2 days after the rescue and hadn't returned. Claire read the article twice sitting in Frank's kitchen with coffee going cold in front of her. She'd stayed in his spare room for 3 days while the logging road was cleared, though every hour away from the cave felt like wearing someone else's skin. Frank glanced at her over his own paper. Schadenfreude getting to you. I don't feel anything. That's the weird part. I thought I'd feel vindicated or satisfied or something, but I just feel tired. That's because revenge and justice aren't the same thing. One you chase, the other just happens while you're building something else. Claire folded the paper. I need to get back up the mountain. Roads cleared as of this morning. Marcus already drove up to check on your systems. Everything's holding. Solar panels even cleared themselves. Snow slid right off. She stood. Then I'm going home. Frank's expression softened. That cave's home now, isn't it? Yeah, it is. The Bronco made the climb without complaint, tires gripping the packed snow. When Claire finally pulled into the clearing, the sight of the cave entrance, solid cinder block, steel door, glinting in winter sun, hit her with unexpected emotion. This was hers, built by her hands, sustained by her will, proof that she could survive anything. She unsealed the door and stepped inside. The temperature was 54 degrees, the Earth's constant heartbeat. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The stove cold but ready, the battery banks fully charged, the water basin clean. Claire dropped her duffel bag and sat on her bed platform, finally able to breathe. Over the next 2 weeks, she fell back into rhythm. Work for Frank in the mornings, maintenance and survival tasks in the afternoons, reading and writing in the evenings. The world down in the valley continued spinning. Derek's financial collapse, the media coverage gradually fading, spring approaching with its inevitable thaw, but up here, time moved differently. The interview request came through email in late February. A magazine called Mountain Survivor focused on off-grid living, wilderness skills, and self-sufficiency. They'd seen the news coverage and wanted to feature Claire's cave dwelling in their spring issue. We're offering $8,500 for a comprehensive article with photos, engineering details, thermal management, water system, solar setup. Our readers are serious practitioners who'd benefit from your experience. Claire stared at the number. $8,500. More money than she'd seen in one place since Derek had drained their accounts. She wrote back, I'll do it, but I write the article myself. You can edit for style, but the technical content stays mine. They agreed. For the next 3 weeks, Claire documented everything. She photographed the cinder block wall construction, the door installation, the chimney system. She drew diagrams of the water filtration setup, the solar panel arrangement, the thermal insulation layers. She wrote 6,000 words on geothermal principles, moisture management, and winter survival strategies. Marcus helped her fact-check the engineering sections. Frank proofread for clarity. When she finally submitted the piece, it was the most thorough guide to subterranean dwelling anyone had written in decades. The magazine loved it. They published it in the April issue under the title, Fortress of Stone Engineering, a Subterranean Home in the Colorado Rockies. The photos showed Claire in her cave, confident, competent, surrounded by the systems she'd built. The article went viral in prepper and homesteader communities. The check arrived on April 15th. Claire held it for a long moment before depositing it through her phone. $8,500. Suddenly, survival wasn't so precarious. She used $2,000 to upgrade her solar system, 4 additional panels, a better charge controller, higher capacity batteries. Another 1,000 went to improving her water setup with a UV filtration system and a backup hand pump. 500 bought a satellite internet upgrade to proper broadband speeds. The rest she saved. Emergency fund, future, options. But the money brought something else attention. A publisher in New York emailed about a book deal. A documentary filmmaker wanted to follow her for a year. Speaking invitations arrived from survival expos and women's conferences. A company that made off-grid equipment offered to sponsor her in exchange for product reviews. Claire declined them all. The cave wasn't a brand, it was sanctuary. Though she did accept one invitation from the Gunnison Community College asking her to speak to their environmental science class about sustainable living. 20 students, 1 hour, no cameras. She stood at the front of the classroom in early May, wildflowers just starting to bloom in the high country, and talked about what she'd learned. Not just the technical details, but the harder truths. The earth doesn't care about your degree or your job title or how much money you have. It cares whether you can adapt, whether you can learn, whether you have the humility to accept that nature's been doing this longer than you have. She paused. I went into that cave thinking I was just surviving, but somewhere along the way I realized I was learning to live. There's a difference. A student in the back raised her hand. Do you ever get lonely? Claire considered the question honestly. Yes, but I learned that loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing. Loneliness is feeling unseen even when you're surrounded by people. Solitude is being alone and still feeling whole. After the talk, 3 students approached asking follow-up questions. One of them, a young woman named Rita, with calloused hands and intelligent eyes, mentioned she was studying sustainable architecture. What you built, it's brilliant. Low impact, thermally efficient, completely off-grid. I'm doing my thesis on alpine dwelling design. Would you be willing to let me document your setup? Just for academic purposes, not publication. Claire thought about Vanessa, another architect who'd been more interested in aesthetics than integrity. But Rita's enthusiasm felt different, genuine curiosity rather than career climbing. Come up next week. I'll show you how it works. Rita visited on a Saturday bringing a notebook and a respectful attitude. Claire walked her through every system, explaining the reasoning behind each choice. Rita asked sharp questions and took detailed notes, treating the cave like the engineering marvel it was. As they stood outside watching the sun track across the valley, Rita spoke quietly. My mom left my dad last year. He wasn't abusive, he made her feel small. She's living in a studio apartment now, barely making rent, working 2 jobs. But she says she's happier than she's been in 20 years. She looked at Claire. I think she'd understand what you did here. Claire felt something warm expand in her chest. Tell her she's not alone. Down in the valley, Derek's life continued its controlled demolition. The bank foreclosed on the farmhouse ruins in March. The property went to auction in April. A developer from Denver bought it for $60,000 land value, only with plans to bulldoze what remained and start fresh. Derek attended the auction. Claire heard about it from Frank, who heard it from the auctioneer. Derek had sat in the back row watching everything he'd stolen get sold for a fraction of what he'd owed. When the gavel came down, he'd walked out without speaking to anyone. Vanguard Development collapsed 2 weeks later. The 3 projects that had been in the pipeline all fell through when investors pulled out. Turns out people don't trust developers who showcase property self-destructed. The company filed for bankruptcy protection in May. Derek took a job at Brennan Hardware stocking shelves and cutting keys for $9 an hour. Joe Brennan hired him partly out of pity, partly because he believed in second chances, and partly because he wanted Derek to understand what honest work looked like. Claire saw him once in mid-May when she stopped in to buy screws for a shelf repair. He was in the back wearing a red vest organizing paint cans. He looked thinner, older. He glanced up and their eyes met for a fraction of a second before he looked away. She bought her screws and left. There was nothing to say. Vanessa resurfaced in early June with an announcement on her professional Instagram, excited to share that she joined a prestigious architecture firm in Boulder. The post featured a photo of her in a sleek office glass walls behind her. Apparently, she hadn't learned anything about the fragility of glass. The comments were vicious. People who'd followed the Gunnison farmhouse story showed up in force. Your designs kill people. Hope your firm has good liability insurance. How does it feel to ruin lives for your portfolio? Within 3 days, the post was deleted. Within a week, Vanessa's entire social media presence had gone dark. Claire felt nothing watching this unfold. No satisfaction, no pity. Just a distant observation that consequences were finally catching up to people who'd spent years outrunning them. The real transformation was happening on Dead Bear Bluff. By summer, Claire had turned the cave into something beyond mere survival. The hydroponic garden expanded. She grew lettuce herbs, cherry tomatoes, even strawberries under carefully calibrated OLED lights. The system Marcus had helped her design produced enough fresh vegetables that she started trading surplus to Frank in exchange for meat and other supplies. She built a rainwater collection system for summer months, reducing her dependence on the spring, installed a small wood-fired water heater that let her take actual hot showers, created a reading nook near the entrance where afternoon light filtered in warm and golden. The cave stopped being a shelter and became a home. Visitors started arriving, not many, but enough to matter. Marcus came every few weeks to check systems and drink coffee. Rita returned twice more with professors from the college who wanted to study the thermal efficiency. A journalist from a sustainability podcast did a remote interview that Claire actually enjoyed because the questions were intelligent. And Frank, every Sunday, like clockwork, drove up with groceries and news from the valley. They'd sit outside on the bench Claire had built, watching hawks circle in the thermal drafts and talk about everything and nothing. One Sunday in late June, Frank brought something different, an envelope with a law firm's return address. Claire's stomach tightened. What's this? Don't know. Derek asked me to give it to you. Said he didn't have your address and couldn't bear to drive up himself. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single document, the lien release Preston had wanted her to sign months ago. But there was a note paper-clipped to it in Derek's handwriting. Claire, I'm not asking you to sign this. The house is gone anyway. I'm sending it because I owe you the truth about one more thing. Preston told me about this lien in December before the storm. I was planning to track you down and pressure you into signing so I could refinance and pull out more equity. That's how far gone I was, even after taking everything I wanted more. I'm not that person anymore, or I'm trying not to be. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that what you did saving us, keeping us alive when you had every reason to let us die, it changed something. I see myself clearly now. It's not a comfortable view. The lien doesn't matter anymore, but you should have this paperwork for your records. And you should know that every morning I wake up in my apartment above the hardware store, I think about you in that cave you built with your own hands, and I understand that you were always stronger than I could ever pretend to be. Derek Clare read it twice, then handed it to Frank. He scanned it and whistled low. That's about as close to genuine remorse as I've seen from a man like that. It doesn't change anything. No, but it closes the loop. Frank handed it back. What are you going to do with it? Claire folded the letter and tucked it into the envelope with the lien release. File it away. Maybe someday I'll need it. Maybe I won't. But it's done now. He's done. We're done. Frank nodded. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the valley below turn golden in the evening light. After a while, Frank spoke again. You ever think about coming back down, getting a regular place? Why would I do that? Don't know. Most people want running water and electricity and neighbors. Claire smiled. I have running water and electricity, and the neighbors up here are better hawks, elk, the occasional bear. They mind their own business. Fair point. Frank stood, joints creaking. Well, when winter comes again, you let me know if you need anything. Marcus says your setup can handle another Goliath-level storm, but that don't mean you should be completely alone. I won't be. I'll have Max. Frank raised an eyebrow. Max. Derek's dog. He emailed asking if I'd take him, said his apartment doesn't allow pets, and Max keeps looking for me. She shrugged. Dog didn't do anything wrong, and he's good company. Frank's weathered face cracked into a genuine smile. You're something else, Claire Hartwell. I'm just someone who learned to build on stone instead of sand. Max arrived the following week in Marcus's truck. The golden retriever bounded out and immediately started exploring the cave, sniffing every corner with enthusiastic curiosity. When he finally settled, it was on the floor next to Claire's bed platform, his chin on his paws, dark eyes watching her with absolute trust. In August, a television production company reached out. They were developing a show about extreme homesteading and wanted to feature her cave as a centerpiece episode. The offer was substantial, $15,000 for 3 days of filming. Claire's first instinct was to refuse. Cameras in her sanctuary felt like violation. But Frank, when she asked his opinion, raised a practical point. That money could buy you a backup generator upgrade. Your medical supplies fund a year of supplies. And maybe, just maybe, some woman watching TV in a bad situation sees you and realizes she's got options. She negotiated terms. No filming inside the cave without her explicit approval for each shot. No dramatization or fake conflict. She would fact-check the script. They agreed. The crew arrived in early September, 5 people with equipment and release forms. The director, a woman named Angela Miller, had done her research and asked intelligent questions. They filmed Claire explaining her systems, demonstrating daily routines, discussing the engineering challenges. On the second day, Angela asked about Derek. The story that brought you to national attention was the rescue, your ex-husband showing up during the blizzard. Can you talk about that night? Claire had known this was coming. She'd rehearsed answers in her head, trying to find words that were honest without being performative. He knocked on my door, and I had a choice. Let him die or let him in. It wasn't about forgiveness or nobility. It was about refusing to let his cruelty turn me into something I wasn't. You don't become strong by imitating the people who hurt you. You become strong by choosing differently. Angela's eyes sharpened. That's powerful. Can we get that again, maybe with you standing outside the cave entrance? No, you can use what I just said or nothing. I'm not performing my trauma for better visuals. Angela nodded slowly. Fair enough, we'll use it as is. The episode aired in November. Claire didn't watch it live. She had no television in the cave and no interest in seeing herself on screen. But Rita texted her afterward. You came across as the most competent human being I've ever seen. Also, you made me want to learn masonry. The response was overwhelming. Claire's email inbox flooded with messages. Some wanted consultations. Some wanted to apprentice with her. Some just wanted to say they'd been inspired. And buried in the flood was one message that stopped her cold. The subject line read, "From Vanessa Cole." Claire almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity, or maybe the need for closure, made her click. Claire, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect anything from you. But I watched the episode and I need to say something I should have said a year ago. I destroyed your life for my career. I knew exactly what Derek was doing, and I helped him do it because it benefited me. I told myself it was just business, that personal feelings didn't matter in professional contexts. I was wrong. Watching you on that show, seeing what you built with your own hands while I was chasing awards and recognition, it made me understand something. You have integrity I'll never possess. You chose to be human when you could have chosen revenge. I chose ambition every single time, and it left me with nothing real. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that you were right and I was wrong about everything that matters. I quit architecture. I'm working at a nonprofit now, helping design affordable housing. It doesn't pay well and no one's writing articles about me, but at least I'm building things that help people instead of serving my ego. I'm sorry. That word is insufficient, but it's all I have. Vanessa. Claire read it 3 times, searching for manipulation or self-service. But the tone felt different from the sharp, calculated woman who'd sat in Derek's Range Rover. This sounded like someone who'd hit bottom and was trying to climb back up. She sat with it for 2 days before responding. Vanessa, I appreciate the apology. It doesn't erase what happened, but it closes a door that needed closing. What you do with your regret is your business. What I do with my life is mine. We're even now. Don't contact me again. Claire. She hit send and felt something release in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the end of carrying anger like a stone. In December, a package arrived via Frank, a letter from Preston Wade with another document. Claire opened it warily. Inside was a property deed. The farmhouse lot, the empty patch of ground where her old life had stood, had been titled in her name. A notarized letter from Derek, explained Claire. The developer who bought the property went bankrupt. The lot went to auction in November. I used what was left of my savings to buy it back. I'm transferring it to you free and clear. No strings, no conditions. This should have been yours from the beginning. It was yours, you restored it, you loved it, you bled for it. I stole it. I can't undo that, but I can do this. I don't want gratitude or forgiveness. I just want you to have what should have been yours all along. The deed is real. Preston verified everything. It's yours. Do with it whatever you want, Derek. Claire stared at the papers, emotions warring in her chest. Anger that he thought this fixed anything. Surprise that he'd actually done it. Confusion about what the hell she was supposed to do with an empty lot she'd stopped wanting the moment she'd built something better. She called Frank. He drove up that evening, read the documents, and whistled low. That property's worth about $75,000 now. Location's good valley views. You could sell it easy. I don't want his guilt money. It ain't guilt money, it's restitution. There's a difference. Frank handed back the folder. You don't have to decide today, but don't reject it just because it came from him. You earned this lot 10 times over. Claire sat with the decision for a week. Finally, she drove down to Gunnison and met with a different real estate lawyer, not Preston, someone with no connection to Derek. She had the deed verified, then listed the property for sale. It sold in 3 days for $78,000. She took the check and stared at it for a long time. More money than she'd ever seen at once. Enough to change everything if she wanted it to. But what did she want? The cave was paid for, the land was hers outright. Her systems were optimized. Her consulting business generated steady income. She had no debt, no rent, no mortgage. The money represented pure freedom. She divided it strategically. $20,000 went into a high-yield savings account emergency fund, untouchable. $10,000 to Frank and Marcus as belated payment for everything they'd done. $5,000 donated to the women's shelter in Denver. $3,000 for a professional-grade weather station and backup communications equipment. The remaining $40,000 she invested in expanding her property. She bought the adjacent 15-acre parcel that went up for sale, doubling her land. Hired a surveyor to map it properly. Began planning a second structure, not another cave, but a small workshop above ground where she could store equipment and conduct consultations without bringing strangers into her primary sanctuary. By February, construction was underway. She did most of the work herself, with Marcus supervising the technical aspects. Poured a concrete foundation, framed walls with salvaged lumber, installed a wood stove and basic utilities. The workshop took 3 months to complete. When she finally stood back and looked at it, a sturdy 12 by 16 structure with good insulation and her own design touches, she felt the same satisfaction she'd felt finishing the cave. This was hers, built with knowledge she'd earned and money she'd reclaimed. Spring came early the second year. By March, wildflowers were already blooming. Claire spent her mornings working on a book. A publisher in New York had been persistent, and she'd finally agreed. Not a memoir, she wasn't interested in trauma porn, but a practical guide to off-grid living with her personal story as framework. She spent April writing in focused bursts. Max curled at her feet, the stove crackling. The work was harder than she'd expected. Technical writing came easily, but the personal sections required excavating memories she'd tried to bury. The manuscript went to her editor in May. Revisions took another 3 months. The book was scheduled for publication in November under the title Fortress Building: A Life on Your Own Terms. In June, she received news that Derek had gotten married. A woman named Carol, a carpenter he'd met at a sustainable building cooperative in Pueblo. The information came through Frank, who'd heard it from Joe. Claire felt nothing. Derek was a character from someone else's story, now a problem she'd solved and filed away. In July, Joe Brennan called and asked if she'd consider teaching a weekend workshop on off-grid construction techniques. We've got young builders coming up who want to learn, but most of the old-timers are dying off and taking their knowledge with them. You've got practical experience they need. I'll pay you $2,000 for the weekend, plus you'd be helping preserve skills that matter. Claire agreed. The workshop was held at the community college, 20 participants ranging from college students to middle-aged career changers. She taught them about thermal mass moisture management, passive solar design, showed them how to calculate load-bearing requirements and work with salvaged materials. But the real teaching happened when a student asked, "How do you know when a structure's going to hold, like really hold, not just pass inspection?" Claire thought about the cave during Goliath. Because you understand what you're working with, not just the specs on paper, but the actual material. You learn stone by touching stone. You learn timber by splitting timber. You can't design your way around reality. You have to work with it. The workshop became an annual event. By the second year, she had a waiting list. The book launched in November to unexpectedly strong reviews. It hit several bestseller lists in the survival and homesteading categories. NPR interviewed her. The New York Times ran a profile. Claire turned down most of the offers that followed. She accepted a handful of speaking engagements at universities and sustainability conferences. Did 3 interviews with outlets she respected, but she didn't leave the cave for longer than a week at a time. Didn't let success pull her away from the life she'd built. Book royalties began arriving in December. Claire put most of it into conservation easements on her land, ensuring it could never be developed. Used some to upgrade the workshop, adding better insulation and a small library of building manuals for students. The rest went into a fund she established with the Women's Shelter and Denver Grants for women leaving dangerous situations, specifically for housing deposits, job training, and emergency supplies. She named it the Raymond Boone Resilience Fund after the grandfather who'd left her the land that saved her life. In March of the 3rd year, a letter arrived forwarded by her publisher. Physical mail, the old-fashioned kind. The return address was Derek Hartwell. She almost threw it away unopened. But 3 years had passed. Curiosity won. Derek's handwriting was the same as always, careful and controlled. "Claire, I know you said not to contact you. I'm breaking that rule once and then never again. I'm writing because I needed to say this. You saved my life twice. Once when you opened that door, and again when you showed me what integrity looks like. I don't expect you to care, but watching how you rebuilt yourself taught me that maybe I could do the same. I'm not that man anymore. The one who valued appearance over substance, who confused theft with ambition. I'll probably never be someone you'd respect, but at least I'm trying to be someone I don't hate. I hope the cave keeps you warm. I hope you build 1,000 more things. I hope you never think of me again. But if you do think of me, I hope you know that saving me wasn't wasted. I'm trying to honor it by becoming worth saving. Goodbye, Claire." Derek. She read it twice, then filed it away. Documents from a life that felt increasingly distant. Derek's transformation, if genuine, was his business. She'd given him his second chance. What he did with it wasn't her responsibility. But there was something satisfying in knowing that the choice she'd made that frozen night had rippled outward, changed someone who'd seemed beyond changing. Maybe that was the real victory. Not that she'd survived, but that she'd survived without becoming the kind of person who lets others freeze. By the 4th year, Claire had been living in the cave long enough that the rhythms felt eternal. Max was graying around the muzzle content to sleep by the fire rather than exploring. The systems she'd built ran so smoothly they barely required maintenance. She'd accepted 3 apprentices, 2 women and 1 man, all in their 20s, all serious about learning. They arrived in August and spent 6 weeks living in temporary structures on her land, learning to build with stone and timber to design for climate instead of against it. One of the apprentices, a woman named Sarah, who'd left an abusive marriage, approached Claire on the last day of the program. I came here to learn building skills, but what I actually learned was that I am capable of more than I thought, that I can trust myself, that being alone isn't the same as being lonely. Her eyes were bright. Thank you for showing me what's possible. Claire gripped her shoulder. You showed yourself. I just held the space. That's exactly what I needed someone to do. In October of the 5th year, exactly 5 years after Derek had handed Preston Wade those keys, Claire spent the day quietly. She hiked to the highest point on her property and looked down at the valley where her old life had existed. The lot where the farmhouse used to stand was empty still. Maybe someday someone would build there. Maybe it would stay empty. She didn't care either way. That life was finished. This life, the one she'd carved from stone and stubbornness, was everything. She thought about Derek and Vanessa occasionally, the way you think about characters in a book you finished years ago. Their choices had set her on this path, but they didn't define it. She'd done that herself. As the sun set, painting the valley in shades of amber and gold, Claire made her way back to the cave. Max trotted beside her, gray-muzzled and content. Smoke rose from the chimney she'd left the stove burning low. The solar panels gleamed in the last light. She'd been thrown into the cold and expected to die. Instead, she'd learned to make fire, had turned exile into kingdom survival, into mastery loss, into legacy. The door opened at her touch, warm air spilling out to meet the cool evening. She stepped inside and sealed the entrance. Claire Hartwell sat on her bed platform, Max settling at her feet, and opened her journal. The entry she wrote was simple. 5 years ago, I lost everything I thought mattered. Tonight, I have everything that actually does. I am not who I was. I am not who they tried to make me. I am who I built myself to be, one stone at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. This is my fortress. This is my foundation. This is my life built on bedrock instead of sand. And no storm, not winter, not betrayal, not the cruelty of people who mistake destruction for strength can shake it. I went into the earth broken. I emerged whole, not because someone saved me, but because I learned that salvation was something you built with your own hands. She closed the journal and leaned back against the limestone wall, ancient, solid, eternal. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. Inside, the temperature held steady at 68 degrees. Let it snow. Let winter come. Let the mountain test her again. She was ready. She had always been ready. She just hadn't known it until she'd stopped waiting to be saved and started building her own damn fortress.